Hola, ¿cómo estás? Espero que estés súper bien. This is Tamara Marie, host of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Now, before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know about a special opportunity that you're definitely going to want to take advantage of, especially if your goal is to become fluent in Spanish. For a limited time only, my team is opening the doors to listeners of the podcast to take advantage of a free language coaching session. Now, in this session, it's not just we're teaching you about verbs or grammar, but we're really going to do a deep dive into what are your goals for learning Spanish, assess where you are on your journey to fluency at the moment, and help you map out a 90-day plan for how you can get to fluency. So we are going to help you take your Spanish to the next level, whether you're afraid of speaking Spanish or you just get a little bit nervous when you're talking to native speakers, or maybe you've got some of the basics down, but you really know that you struggle with getting your Spanish to flow and your listening skills aren't up to par. Whatever it is, even if it is a specific grammar issue, we will help you map out how to tackle that. And normally these sessions do cost, so we are offering a few slots for free. There are limited spaces available and they'll only be open up through the end of the month. So make sure you sign up. Go to SpanishConSalsa.com/coach. That's SpanishConSalsa.com/coach to book your free language coaching session where we will help you map out a 90-day plan to get to Spanish fluency. Okay, let's get started with the episode.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast, the show for Spanish learners that love music, travel, and culture. Close your grammar textbooks, shut down the language apps, and open your ears to how Spanish is spoken in the real world. Let us show you how to go from beginner to bilingual. Here is your host, certified language coach, Tamara Marie.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a episodio 29. Welcome to episode 29 of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. In this episode, I'm bringing you a conversation with Shay Spence, the founder of Español en 3000, or Spanish in 3000. Shay arrived in Medellin, Colombia in June 2017 on his own personal mission to become conversationally fluent in Spanish. But after he advanced past the beginner stage, he really struggled to find resources to study real-life conversational Spanish. So he decided to build his own. After working closely with some amazing local teachers in Colombia, Español en 3000 was born. Shay doesn't claim to be a Spanish teacher. He is a Spanish learner just like you. In this episode, we talk all about how he improved his conversational Spanish and some of his tips for how you can do the same. He also shares a little bit about the culture of Medellin and some Colombian slang that will be good to know if you plan to visit the country, which I highly recommend. At the end of our conversation, I'll give you more information on how you can get a special 7-day free trial for the premium version of Español en 3000, so stay tuned until the end so that you can get a link just for listeners of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Okay, so with that, let's get to the conversation with Shay. Hola, Shay. Bienvenido and welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Hey, Tamara. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to finally get this opportunity to talk to you because we've been trying to orchestrate this for a little bit because I'm in the US and you're in Australia, correct?
Yes, I'm in Australia, back in Australia at the moment. I've been here for about 6 months with my Colombian girlfriend who's here learning English, which is cool. I was in Colombia before this for about 2 years, almost 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, learned a lot of Spanish in that time. I arrived to Colombia about a year and a half, 2 years ago with like some really, really basic Spanish that I'd learned for about 3 months before in Argentina. So I arrived to Colombia speaking with a sh accent. Pocho está llegando.
Right. Show me, right?
Yeah, so it's really weird in Colombia because it's completely different. But I found that because I found it got a little bit difficult, to be honest, in Argentina because they speak really fast, I find, and the accent's like super thick. So I don't reckon it's a great place to actually learn Spanish, but it's definitely a cool country. I love Buenos Aires as a city. It's really, really nice.
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. I went there a few years ago by accident, actually. That's a long story. One of my travel stories that I'm actually going to be telling in a future episode of the podcast. But yeah, I ended up in Buenos Aires. And I find it to be a very European city. Like people there have a very Italian sentiment, but they're speaking Spanish. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's just exactly like Italians that are speaking Spanish, hey? And they like speak with their hands and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's just beautiful. I'm absolutely obsessed with that city. It's just like the nightlife and stuff there is just amazing.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about you and then how you got started with learning Spanish and how you got interested in the language. Was it your trip to Buenos Aires that got you started, or what was it that made you want to speak Spanish?
Well, basically what got started for me really was here in Australia. I'm an electrician, and I was running my own business for, you know, almost 3 years at the time, and just hadn't had a holiday for a long time, and just was getting a bit stressed out with work. And one day I just went to the travel agent and booked a trip to Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And long story short, like completely fell in love with the whole sort of Latin experience that I had in those 3 countries. You know, saw all these people speaking Spanish and like listened to the music and just sort of fell in love with that sort of culture aspect of everything. And so I came back to Australia and I'm like, screw this, I'm going to like just go and make this happen for me. And so I sold a bunch of stuff, got rid of my car, and just flew over to Argentina with like a one-way trip. And
wow.
Yeah, well, initially the plan was to stay in Argentina because I had a friend there that I met on the trip and all that sort of stuff, and it just seemed like a really cool place to be. But after about 3 months, I already had a trip planned, and I went over to Cuba with a friend, and we spent a month in Cuba. And the original plan was to go back to Buenos Aires. So I had the tickets and everything booked, but on my way back through, I stopped back in Colombia because it was part of the sort of the flight path, and I was there for a few days, and I sort of really realized that like Colombia was a lot of the reason that I sort of fell in love and wanted to go back over to Latin America. And like I said before a little bit as well, the Spanish is so much easier in Colombia, especially in Bogota, where I was at that time for a few days. It's just like very clear, sort of neutral, if you want to say neutral. I don't really believe that there is a neutral Spanish, but it's about as neutral as you're probably going to get, I think, in Colombia. And so, yeah, I just sort of said, screw it, I'm just going to stay here and see how we go. And so I booked a trip or a plane trip to Medellin, and basically just never left Medellin for like a year and a half. And yeah, ended up starting a really cool project with a bunch of Spanish teachers that I met there in sort of my journey to become, you know, fluent and looking for other stuff. But yeah, we'll get onto that maybe in a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting. You initially wanted to travel, right? And I know a lot of people, it's a huge motivation for language learning, right? It's like you want to see the world and you want to explore. And it's interesting you're talking about different dialects as well, like going from Cuba to Peru to Chile, Argentina, like they all have their different ways of speaking Spanish. So how did you approach getting from, you know, sort of traveling around to different places and really getting an ear for these different dialects? Like how did you approach getting to conversational fluency from just kind of struggling through all of that as you were traveling and learning as you went?
Well, I think you pick up different things from different places, and I think it's definitely like essential. It's not like English. English is like, for example, really quite neutral in every way where it's spoken. Like it has its own little accents and little words, but Spanish is completely different in some countries than it is in others. And you need to sort of be able to communicate and understand a few of these little nuances. Like, for example, in Argentina, the double L is a sh. In Colombia, it's more of a j. In Chile, it's more of a y. But they all sort of mean the same thing, but it just sounds completely different. So if you want to be able to communicate with a wide variety of people, you sort of need to be aware of those things. But I think the first place that I started learning Spanish, right, in Argentina was, in hindsight, a bad choice because it's extremely difficult, even for some like native speakers. Sometimes speaking to to a person from Buenos Aires is difficult because they speak really fast and they use heaps of slang and it sounds very different. But then jumping over to somewhere like Colombia, where it's very sort of neutral, and I find that they speak generally quite slowly, and I found it a lot easier. And then you can sort of branch out and be able to listen to other resources, watching movies. Initially, watching movies really helped me. Like I would literally, even in the first few months of learning Spanish, I would just sit and watch movies. I didn't understand almost anything, but I would just sit there and watch it with the subtitles on, just repetitively, a whole series for like 100 episodes. And I found like at the end, you know, you start to understand and see patterns and all that sort of stuff. You might not totally understand everything that's going on, but I felt that helped me quite a lot in the beginning.
Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the project you mentioned that you started in Colombia, because I think, you know, listening comprehension is one of the biggest problems that I hear from Spanish learners across the board. It's like, I can read it, it makes sense if I see it, I can speak a little bit sometimes, but when I hear a native speaker talking to me, I get completely lost. Like that's one of the number one issues I hear for anyone trying to learn Spanish. So I think the project that you have, Español en 3000, is really interesting in that regard. So could you tell us a little bit about it and how it got started?
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with why it's called Español en 3000. It's actually a really interesting study that I came across in my process of, you know, I'm the type of person that sort of when I want to do something, I'll like research and just read and find all the information I possibly can about that subject. So basically I did the same thing with Spanish, you know, reading blogs, you know, similar to your blog, there's, you know, lots of really good resources out there. And I found this study by a guy named Mark Davies that was done in the Brigham Young University. I don't know exactly what year it was, but he did a study, right, of about 20 million different Spanish words, not separate words, but he had a 20 million word corpus, he calls it. And he pulls all these words out of different places like newspapers and other written things and movies and recordings, interviews, everything. And he did a big study to see what the frequency of words, right? So what is the relation with frequency to how easily can you learn the language and how much can you speak in different situations, right? So at 3,000 words, the most common 3,000 words in Spanish, a Spanish learner can communicate in 94% of situations completely fluently. And I was like, that's a really cool number, you know, because you go to a lot of language classes and sometimes it feels like super overwhelming because you're like, how am I ever going to learn all this? Like, it just seems like there's just this endless list of words and things to learn. And that 3,000 words was just like something really cool to me. It's like, okay, there's that like goal, you know, maybe I don't get there. Maybe I get to 1,000 words or 2,000. And even at 1,000 words, you're something like 88% of situations completely fluently. So still, that's like amazing. And so we basically do all of our resources around that sort of 3,000 words. And how we do it is basically, I've got a couple of Spanish teachers who are also very good friends of mine. And back about 18 months ago, we sort of got together and we're like, how can we build something that could be a really amazing resource for people learning Spanish? And at the time it was for me. I was like, I want this resource basically for me. And the thing that I'd sort of noticed with a lot of resources out there is there was a lot of sort of apps and other sort of resources that are, someone like designs the conversation. So they sit down and write them first, and they often sound quite sort of manufactured and not very native, and it's just not how people really speak. I think that's basically, it could be one of the reasons why people get so confused, and I got so confused with native speakers, is because they just speak and it doesn't sound like the resources that we've got in our textbooks, because it's not.
Exactly. You never hear that conversation, hola, ¿cómo está usted? Right? Like always, like that's how they always start teaching you conversational Spanish, and you just go, I've never heard anyone talk that way, right? That's not how people introduce themselves in real life.
No, it's like in real life, they're like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Like really fast, or ¿qué más pues? Like if you're in Medellin, ¿qué más pues is like super, super common. But it sounds like if you heard that as a Spanish learner, it's like, ¿qué más pues? It's like, what else well in English? It's like, what the hell? That doesn't mean anything, but it's like exactly. Super common. Everyone from like a 50-year-old to a 10-year-old will address someone as ¿qué más? It's like, what's up in English. And they're those sort of little nuances and other things that you can learn from real conversational Spanish. So basically what we do, I gave it to these teachers and I said, go out and find the most interesting and coolest people you can in the streets, bars, cafes, homes, everywhere here in Medellin, and have an amazing conversation with them. And let's turn that into an amazing resource for us to study Spanish. Initially, it was just for me because I wanted to test it out and I was a little bit selfish. Like, I just want to have this all to myself. And then I just started sharing it with other friends who are learning and like, this is amazing. We've got to like put this out and help other people. So that's how sort of Español en 3.0 was born. And we sort of made it into more of a resource that was online and people can access it and do all these other things. But we don't just leave it like at the conversation, because listening to a conversation is awesome. But then you get the problem of you don't understand a word, or, you know, often when native people are speaking, it sort of blends into just like a wall of sound. And it's like, I can't really hear where the difference of words is. So we do a transcription as well. So we have a word by word transcription. So you can sort of actually listen and read at the same time, which I found that to sort of skyrocket the results that I was getting, because you're actually listening and also reading. So you can have that connection with the sound and the written word. And so that when you're listening to it in a real conversation, it doesn't like outside of the resources, you can, you know, use that sort of training to recognize what people are saying. So it doesn't sort of sound like just this wall of sound, which I'm sure you probably hear it often. Yeah.
You get that association between, you know, what you see and then what you hear. So yeah, I think the transcripts are really important too, because I found with listening comprehension, especially when you read something, right, and you're reading as a native English speaker and you kind of read it out in your head, like you're pronouncing things in your head with your, you know, your bad gringo accent, right? You're like, in your head, you're reading it like, hola, ¿cómo estás, right? But when you hear it from a native speaker and you're reading it along that way, then you start to encode in your brain their pronunciation, which is, you know, a lot more useful than reading without listening. So I always recommend that. So I think that's a great idea to combine those two, because it really does help you get it into your head, and then also make it useful so you can access it when you really have to use it and have a conversation.
Totally. And it might sound a little bit cheesy and stuff like this, but I totally reckon that it's like printing the vocabulary and the Spanish into your brain. Like, everyone thinks, you know, you can, you know, grab an app and do some sort of Duolingo thing, and that's awesome for a certain stage. But I think that once you get to a certain stage where you're, and this is just my experience, like I don't want to be some guru telling people how to learn Spanish. It's just, I'm just speaking of my experience and the experience of friends and other people around me that have been using our resources, is that, you know, it's just about repetition, and it's about connecting the Spanish that you're learning with real life things that are interesting, and something that you can, you know, I find personally difficult to remember a flashcard. Like, there's nothing interesting about a flashcard to me to make me remember it. Maybe if you show it to me every day, I'll remember it, but there's nothing interesting about that flashcard. But whereas if there's an interesting subject that someone's talking about in a conversation, and you learn a new word in that conversation, in that sentence, that's really interesting. And that for me connects in my brain, and I will actually remember that, if you know what I mean. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the context is super important, right? Learning out of context, it's like, oh, just give me a list of random words. And unless you're like a memory champion or something, right? You're like, you're not going to
Which is well the majority of us are not memory champions.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that, yeah, I mean, and with me, you know, sort of in my own experience too, you know, I found that my connection was similar to your story, just connecting with the music and the culture was something that was really important to me. So
especially the salsa.
Oh yeah,
Learn
definitely.
Spanish con Salsa podcast.
As the name would suggest, right? But yeah, definitely. So for me, I fell in love with the dance and the music, and it just all sort of connected for me. So I learned a lot through song lyrics because I had context there, and I definitely had repetition, right? And it was something I was just naturally interested in. So I wanted to know what the songs meant. It wasn't like a forced, you know, oh, I have to learn these 8 units of, you know, this grammar book, you know, to get fluent in Spanish. It was, oh, I want to know this song. This is really interesting. So yeah, I think the context interest really speaks to motivation, which is one of the primary things you need to persevere in language learning. Because other than that, it can be really difficult to stay going when you get discouraged from not understanding something.
Totally. Or get a girlfriend or a boyfriend in the other language. It's like a super good motivator. The first date that I had with my current lovely girlfriend, it was extremely sad about my Spanish. It was very early days and she was very patient with me, so it definitely helps. Or even just a friend. It doesn't even have to be a girlfriend or a boyfriend or anything, but just find a friend that you're interested in and that you want to get to know and that only speaks Spanish. And you'll be amazed on how much you'll learn just by trying and just by making a fool of yourself, trying and making mistakes and then getting corrected. It all helps, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, someone that only speaks that language, because what I found is that my friends that I have that are bilingual, it's much harder for us to stick to Spanish in our conversation. One, because I live in the US and English is the dominant language here. And, if you're in a group where some people speak English and some people speak Spanish, generally we end up defaulting to English because that's just more comfortable for everybody. So it's really hard when you're talking to someone that's bilingual because it's not necessary that you communicate in Spanish. But if you do find someone that has very low English proficiency or just has a higher comfort level with Spanish, or like in your case is extraordinarily patient with you, it becomes easier to really make progress and to focus on your listening comprehension, your conversation skills and all of that, because otherwise, it's so easy. The brain is looking for the path of least resistance, right? So it's so easy to go back into English when you're struggling to find a word and you want to keep the conversation going. But if you have someone that doesn't speak English, you can't use that as a reference point. So I think that's a great point you made, that, yeah, you have to be able to talk to people, but also, keep in mind, if your goal is to improve your Spanish, that talking to someone that lets you off the hook, so to speak, is not always the best. So yeah, I think that's really useful. And I want to ask you too, because I always ask my guests this question, because I think that it's good for the listeners to hear that all of us that, speak, Spanish and English and we're learning, that we didn't just magically, fall into this place where we're like, now I'm fluent, right? Like we had our struggles along the way. So I always like to share those to kind of encourage people that it's okay to make mistakes. So if you have a story you could share about either like the funniest mistake you made, something that was embarrassing or not, like depending on, what you want to share, but just kind of tell us about one of the mistakes that you made and how it stuck with you and how it helped you learn.
Yeah, definitely. There's a really funny one that I always remember, and it was like right back in the beginning when I was in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and I remember getting into a cab, right? And back then, you learn a few words and stuff like this, and a few words stick in your brain. And it was like a really hot day, and I got in the cab, and I'm like, oh, and there was like the cab driver was trying to talk to me or whatever, and I was like waving my head, like trying to, fan my head because it was really hot. And I'm like, oh, estoy caliente. And I didn't think anything of it. And he looked at me in the mirror going, what's going on with this bloke? He didn't say anything, but he just like gave me this weird look. And I'm like, oh, what? Anyway, just brushed it off. Didn't really understand. And then I learned later on, I was telling like a Spanish teacher the story or something like that. And then they're like, basically, you just said to that cab driver that I'm like horny in the back seat of my car. I'm like, what? I thought caliente meant hot. And they're like, no, that's like caliente is like things or objects or like water. But if you're referring to a person as caliente, it's like horny or like sexy. I'm like, oh no. Jesus, that's why this cab driver was looking at me like a weirdo. Yeah, the difference between calor and caliente. That was a bit of a funny one. But there's heaps of moments. Like I remember so many times. Especially I remember when going to meet my girlfriend's family for the first time, and my Spanish was still very, very weak, and just the embarrassment of just like not knowing what's going on at all. It was like Christmas time, and I'm the only foreigner in a big group of Colombians, and no one else speaks English. And it was super difficult, but it's like those are the moments that I reckon that I learned the most, because I reckon learning a language is more about confidence than people understand. Like it's actually a lot of people know a lot more words than they're willing to use because they're just a little bit too embarrassed or a little bit too ashamed to just try or to make mistakes. But it doesn't matter if you're making mistakes, as long as that other person understands you. It doesn't matter if you're grammatically incorrect. Like, even native speakers aren't grammatically correct all the time, just because that's how people speak. Like, we don't talk in English grammatically correct all the time. I know I don't.
Yeah, if we did, we'd sound really uptight, I think. Right?
Yeah, like proper Queen's English just doesn't get spoken.
Yeah, and it's the same with Spanish too. And I wanted to come back and ask you a question. So you mentioned like meeting your girlfriend's family for the first time, and we talked a little bit earlier about some of the things that are said in Medellin. So I was curious to know, is there any slang or any words in particular that are particular to the region of Medellin that you learned as you moved there and lived there for a few years? Was there, were there things you found there that weren't in Argentina or Peru or the other places you had traveled?
Definitely. I mean, Medellin is like a super, super cool place. Like, if anyone has not been to Medellin or Colombia in general, they definitely have to go. The locals actually, in the more of a slang word, they actually call it Medallo, not Medellin. It's more common to say Medellin, but it's sort of more in like the barrios, like the little places, little sort of areas of Medellin. They'll say Medallo, which is interesting. But ¿qué más pues? Like, what's up? It's like, what's up in English. That's super common in Medellin, but they add the pues bit. So in the whole of Colombia, ¿qué más is very common, but they add pues at the end. And that's sort of a very common expression or greeting in Medellin. They actually add pues to everything. So it doesn't mean anything. So like, pues is like well in English, or just, it's like a filler word. But they just add it to the end of every single expression or anything. And it kind of sounds like if you're speaking to a paisa, which is a person from Medellin, it often you'll hear pues every 5 to 10 seconds, 30 seconds. It's they're kind of famous.
Has their giveaway word, right?
Yeah, they're very famous for using a lot of pues. But there's also heaps of other words like parcero. Parcero is like dude or, man in English, or in Argentina it's boludo, or in Mexico it's like güey. In Medellin it's parcero or parcera. But they also shorten it, and they also say parce. ¿Qué más parce? They have another word that is like cool or, like awesome. They say bacano. You heard of bacano before?
Yeah, I've heard that. Actually, I thought that was more of like a Caribbean word. I know I've definitely seen that before. And I wonder what region exactly. But I've heard that one before outside of Medellin. That's interesting.
I think, words definitely move around to all different places, especially in music and stuff as well. But they're also very similar to that. They'll say charity. You heard of that? You would have heard of that before. Like, que charity. It's like, how cool.
Oh, yeah, chévere.
And I don't know, you've been to Colombia before, haven't you?
I have. I've only been to Cartagena. And that's on the Caribbean coast. So it's actually a little different there. It's interesting. They were explaining to me how their words and their accent are a little bit different than what they call la gente del interior. Basically, like in Bogota and Medellin, they speak different than us. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, they don't speak with any S's in Cartagena.
Yeah, they're very. It's
cut
a
off
very
all the S's.
Caribbean place. That's common in Cuba, in the República Dominicana, in Puerto Rico. They all have that feature. So I was surprised to find that in Colombia, actually, because I didn't know that much about Colombia before I went. And they definitely have a Caribbean flair in Cartagena. So I imagine it's a bit different in Medellin.
Yeah, I always think like Colombia, the different like estados are like different countries all within them. Like the culture's so different, the people are different, the accent's different. The food's so different. It's like Colombia has like 7 countries within one. It's like each different area is like noticeably different, which makes it really cool. So did you have any aguardiente when you were in Cartagena?
I did actually. I went on a boat tour and went to Tierra Bomba, and we had fresh fish too. It was just a beautiful place. Nice. I definitely want to go back to Colombia, and I haven't made it to Medellin, but you're making me want to rethink that.
They in Medellin they say guaro for aguardiente,
Okay.
which is like a little slang word. And they drink it in 2-liter bottles. Like you go out to a fonda, which is another probably very Colombian word, which is like a nightclub. But a fonda is a very specific type of nightclub that plays all types of tropical music. You know, your salsas and your vallenatos and reggaeton, bachata, all those types of things, merengue. And
you're saying is that's where I need to go.
Yeah, that's right. They call it a crossover. So it's a crossover like a fonda, but it's like a crossover fonda, right? And it's normally painted in really bright colors, and they've got like, you know, really cool stuff all around on the walls and all that sort of stuff. And you'll go there with a big bunch of friends and you'll all put in, you know, 10,000 pesos or 20,000 pesos. 20,000 pesos or 10,000 pesos, and you'll buy a jarra, which is like a big bottle of guaro, which is 2 liters, and they'll put this big 2-liter bottle on your table, and they'll put you like a bunch of plastic shot glasses and a big jug of water and maybe some fruit and stuff like that. You just drink water and shot guaro and dance all night.
Sounds like a party.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing a little bit about Medellin. Hopefully you've encouraged some people who are listening who haven't been to book a trip there. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and go into our quick fire round. So this is where I ask you 5 questions in Espanol for you to answer off the top of your head. So, ¿listo?
Sí, listo, vamos.
Ok. Pregunta número 1 es, ¿cuál es tu canción favorita en español?
Ay, no sé. He estado escuchando últimamente mucho de Nicky Jam. Y también escucho mucho vallenato, porque mi novia es de Valledupar, que es una ciudad un poquito cerca de Santa Marta, como la mitad de Santa Marta y Cartagena. Y ¿has escuchado de vallenato?
Sí, yo escuché mucho cuando estaba en Cartagena.
Sí, vallenato es como la música de esa tierra y la casa de vallenato es Valledupar. Y entonces escuchamos mucho vallenato en nuestra casa.
¿Y tienes una canción de vallenato que puedes recomendar?
Claro, hay un cantante que se llama Silvestre Dangond.
Y pregunta número 2 es, ¿cuál es tu palabra favorita de español?
He estado buscando esa palabra en inglés, pero creo que no existe. Es canzón o canzona. No creo que eso existe en inglés. Canzón es como cuando una persona está preguntándote siempre para algo, como ¿por qué no vamos a hacer eso? Porque bla, 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 bla. Esa persona es un canzón. Es como que está molestándote.
Sí,
pero...
sí entiendo. Creo que no puedo pensar en una palabra en inglés tampoco, pero es como annoying.
Sí, un poquito como annoying, pero es muy útil. Siempre mi novia me está diciendo, ay, canzón, tranquilo.
Cry baby.
Yeah, it's like a little bit like that, but sí, no creo que tenemos esa palabra en inglés. Es no como decir, ay, you're so annoying. No hablamos así en inglés.
Y número 3, ¿cuál fue la última cosa que leíste, miraste o escuchaste en español?
La última cosa que escuché en español probablemente fue una conversación o una mini lección de español en 3000. Porque yo estoy haciendo todas las ediciones. Entonces, tengo que escuchar todas las cosas.
Y número 4, saca tu móvil y traduce el último texto que recibiste al español.
Ese mensaje es de un amigo mexicano que está viviendo en Buenos Aires, pero viene aquí a Australia para vivir con su novia australiana. Yo le dije en inglés, good luck with the visa, dude. You should have no problems. You're a top class guy. Y en español dice, buena suerte con la visa. No deberías tener problemas. Eres un chico de primera clase.
Ok, la última pregunta es, ¿hay un lugar en el mundo que tú crees que es el mejor del mundo? Un lugar que para ti es como el cielo.
Pues para mí me encanta Medellín. Me encanta la ciudad, la gente. En general me encanta todo de Colombia. No creo que hay un lugar perfecto en todas las maneras. Porque hay otras cosas que me encanta de mi tierra aquí en Australia y hay otras cosas que me encanta de Perú o de Europa. Entonces no tengo un lugar específico.
Okay, so wrapping up, can you tell us just a little bit about if our listeners want to get some information about Español en 3000, how they can find out more about your program and learning Spanish through conversations?
Yes, basically Español en 3000, 100% made in Medellin, Colombia, with the most coolest or the coolest people. See, we always make mistakes in English. We can do that in Spanish as well.
Right.
With the coolest and most interesting people that we could find in Medellin. You immediately find that when you jump in, it's like stuff that you could use tomorrow or today with your Spanish-speaking friends or family or workmates and all that sort of stuff. And you can find our website as españolen3000.com. It's españolen3000.com. So it's ESPANOLEN 3000.com.
I will include a link on the show notes page so you can look for it there as well. So with that, thank you, Shay, so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And thanks for joining us on the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Tamara. Thank you very much for having me. And all the best to all your listeners with their Spanish. Get out there and just do it. It's the only way to become, as fluent or more fluent in Spanish is to get out there and practice.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Shay. He has definitely inspired me to book a flight to Medellin and return to Colombia. It sounds like a lot of fun, and it's a place that honestly it wasn't on my bucket list, but now I think that I might consider going to Medellin. Now, if you want a 7-day free trial of Español en 3000, go to learnspanishconsalsa.com/3000. That's learnspanishconsalsa.com/3000. And you'll get a special link to a 7-day free trial of the premium version of Español en 3000, which is just for listeners of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Now, I have to say, I have tried this resource myself. I do not recommend things that I don't think will be really effective. And I really think this is great if you are an advanced beginner or at an intermediate level and you really want to challenge yourself to listen to native Spanish speakers, but also get that support that he mentioned with the transcripts, as well as the lessons that are provided in the premium version are very helpful because they explain some of the grammar and some of the slang that's used. And the conversations are really interesting. The topics they cover are very diverse, and they talk to a lot of Spanish speakers that are in Medellin, so people are from all over. So it really makes for an interesting mix of personalities and conversations and topics. So I think you'll definitely enjoy. Now, if you're a complete beginner, this will probably be a little bit too challenging for you, but I do have a resource for you as well. If you go to that same link in the show notes for this episode, which is learnspanishconsalsa.com/3000, you will find a link to our bulletproof guide to your first Spanish conversation. So this is if you're not quite ready to take advantage of a more advanced resource and you're really just trying to get your feet wet with having your first conversation in Spanish. You can download that guide absolutely free, and it's also available on the show notes page for this episode. Okay, so that is it for me. I hope that something that you heard today, as always, takes you one step closer from Spanish beginner to bilingual. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.